Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary, first, are voters still uncomfortable with the idea of a woman president? Then, is it time to start cutting back on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs? I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, women and the presidency.
I wear heels. It's not for a fashion statement. It's because if I see something wrong, we're going to kick them every single time.
Former UN ambassador and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley released a video teasing her expected announcement next week of her presidential bid. She's the first Republican to formally challenge former President Trump for the GOP nomination. More candidates are expected to run against Haley, the daughter of immigrants, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former VP Mike Pence, former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, and a number of others. Some political analysts suspect Haley is really running for vice president. Meanwhile, a recent New York Times article raised eyebrows because it was critical of Vice President Kamala Harris. She's the first woman, the first African American, and the first Asian American to serve as VP. Recent surveys aggregated by the polling site 538 found just fewer than 40% of Americans approve of Harris's job performance. The Times reports critics, even supporters, believe Harris hasn't yet proven she could be a party or country leader. That has some Democrats worried about Harris remaining on the 2024 ticket with a then 82-year-old Joe Biden at the top. Joining me today are former U.S. Representatives Donna Edwards and Nan Hayworth, former judge and federal prosecutor Debra Carnahan, and Washington Examiner columnist Tiana Lowe. Are women under a more high definition microscope when they run for national offices?
Anybody who runs for national office goes under the high definition microscope, Bonnie. So it's certainly not limited to women. Women have taken conspicuous positions of leadership in women who are Republicans in both the Republican Party and, of course, among electorates across the country. We have many women governors who are Republicans, for example, who have performed outstandingly, and including Nikki Haley. And among Republicans, Nikki Haley garners great respect and is regarded very seriously as a candidate, not for vice president, but for president. And I expect her to make a great case for herself and to be highly competitive.
Donna, do you think that Republican voters in particular, let's start with Haley and then go to Vice President Harris, are they ready for a woman of color to be president who's not just of color, but also the daughter of immigrants?
Well, look, I keep thinking that Americans are ready for a woman to be president. And then one, puts herself out there. And I do think that the scrutiny is discernibly different for women. I think the case that Nikki Haley will have to make is not about whether she's a daughter of immigrants, but the case will be, can she separate herself from Donald Trump? Is there a lane for her to travel in that's going to allow her the free rein to make her own case for president? I also think nobody runs to be vice president. I think that's just garbage. If you put yourself out there to be president, you're running to be president. And like with Kamala Harris ran for president. She didn't make it, and she's vice president. And I think it's tough for any vice president to separate themselves and to demonstrate leadership apart from the president with whom they serve. And so I don't think it's a fair judgment of Kamala Harris at this point, and she will have an opportunity, should that opportunity present itself, to make her case to Democrats and to the nation.
What would happen to Black Democrats, and would they even participate in the vote if the naysayers got Biden to kick her off the ticket?
First of all, I just don't think that's going to happen. It is not realistic. The president is going to announce that he's running for re-election. Kamala Harris has been a strong and good partner to him. We may not see all of that because that's the role of a vice president. First of all, the president is one of the most loyal people that you'll ever meet. And so there's no way that he's going to ditch Kamala Harris because there are a few naysayers. And I think that the president will have an opportunity to make his case to the American people, and Kamala Harris will be alongside him to do that.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Donna just said. And I'm going to pick up and segue in. Having known Joe Biden and his family and members of my family working with Joe Biden in the House and the Senate, respectively, he is incredibly loyal. I don't see him dropping her from the ticket. I don't think she's done anything for him to do that. And I think it would be detrimental for him to do that with people of color, possibly also with the immigrant community. I think she's done a good job. And I think the criticism of her is kind of ridiculous because the role of the vice president is not to overshadow the president and to be there just in case. It's a tough role. And I think she's done that well.
So Joe Biden kind of did this to himself. He chose someone as his running mate who couldn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses, right? So Kamala's shortcomings, specifically when it comes to things like dealing with that Lester Holt interview about immigration, right? She's not necessarily very natural in those settings. The area where she really excelled, as we saw her as a senator, was in those Judiciary Committee questionings of judges, right? So she sort of got upgraded in a way that wasn't necessarily incredibly beneficial for her, especially considering that she spent the first 2 years of her vice presidency being forced to stay in D.C. to be that swing vote for the Senate, right? She couldn't be traveling. She couldn't really do any on-the-ground work around the rest of the country or around the rest of the world.
She did a lot in terms of doing research anyway, and I guess working on legislation to stop the flow of illegal immigrants from Central and South America.
But Bonnie, the problem literally has never been worse. We have more migrants coming through the southern border than ever in documented history, right? So I think her touting immigration, that's a net loss. And also, to an extent, that's also not her fault because she's not the one who decided to rip up Remain in Mexico and those safe third country agreements, right? That's Joe Biden who decided to do that. And he did that with full knowledge from Republican senators like Tom Cotton, who warned, if you rip up these agreements, the immigration problem is going to get worse. So in part, Biden is sort of stuck to her because he chose this. She has not been in a terribly favorable position. And most importantly, as Debra pointed out, Joe Biden values loyalty and the fact that, you've seen lots of leaks from Kamala's office, impugning the motivations or criticizing the vice president, right? But you've never heard any leaks criticizing Biden. And that is a sign that Kamala is not directing her staff to criticize the president, which means that they are probably stuck with her. I think it's funny when we bring
stuck with her, or
Kamala Harris is a strong and a loyal partner to the president of the United States. They are not in a bind with Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris brings a lot to the ticket. I think that she has reached a really strong appeal, particularly to Black voters and to women.
Donna, her approval ratings are lower than Dick Cheney's were after he shot someone in the face.
Cheney shot somebody by accident and his approval ratings were higher than 40%. I don't recall, quite frankly. But, he was very popular with Republicans and very unpopular with Democrats. So I can't imagine he had way more than 40% approval.
The problem is, Bonnie, we wouldn't even be talking about this if she were popular within the party. These articles don't just happen on their own because the New York Times decides they don't like Kamala Harris. They happen because people come leak to them, right? So clearly there is a degree of unpopularity about her.
I'm just going to say sometimes it really doesn't matter what the party thinks. And case in point, the party and the pundits were saying, run about the economy in this past election, okay, that we just got through in November. And she was out there, the vice president was out there talking about Roe v. Wade, staying on point. It turns out, yes, that was the issue that really swung this election and really reduced the amount of Republicans that went into the House. So I think her political acumen is very good. And she went out there and she did that for the president. So we need to focus on some of these more positive things. And if the inside the Beltway Democrats, some of the party leaders say, I'm not so excited about her, the voters are in many ways. I know you're going to say the polling, they're not excited about her, but you know what? They're not excited about Joe Biden.
Let me cut to the chase here, however. Nan, your thoughts about both candidates on being the children of immigrants. What about fundraising? Does either of them have what it takes, what certainly Nancy Pelosi had in spades, to fundraise, to raise money? I know Kamala Harris has a great connection to African-American women, having gone to Howard and being very active with sororities. What about the South Carolina former governor? Does she have the connections?
First, as to their being first-generation Americans, I myself am a first-generation American. And I think certainly, I think Republicans view that as a wonderful strength for a candidate, because I can tell you, and I'm sure Donna can say the same thing, having attended naturalization ceremonies when I was a member of Congress, nothing moved me more than witnessing new American citizens renounce completely their previous allegiances in order to become part of this incredible country. Immigrants and their children understand probably better than many other Americans what it means to be in this country and what makes this country distinctive.
January 6th, Republicans love the children of immigrants as candidates.
With all due respect, what you're expressing is a classic trope among the left that has no reality whatsoever among Republicans.
Excuse me, there are people who died in that.
Let's put aside January 6th for a moment and talk about fundraising potential, which was the other half of your question, Bonnie. Nikki Haley has already been making the rounds quite effectively and diligently as someone raising funds for her Stand for America PAC. I think she has a strong constituency among Republicans, but I do think this. There is a lot of competition because we have a lot of strong claimants for the Republican presidential nomination coming up. I think the path for a Democrat running for president, or, well, if it were, say, Kamala Harris, I don't think it will be Ms. Harris. I think she's committed a lot of unforced errors that Democrats know well, and certainly Republicans are very much aware of. But the inherent fundraising base for Democrats, especially California Democrats, well, I mean, they own tech. In large measure, not entirely. So no, I don't think Kamala Harris would necessarily have a lot of trouble raising funds, but whether or not those funds would actually translate into votes is an entirely different issue.
Kamala Harris has really strong fundraising chops. She's been doing that, especially the last couple of years, both for House and Senate Democrats as well as for the presidential ticket that's going to be announced shortly. I think Nikki Haley has the potential to be a strong fundraiser, but again, it's a very narrow lane, and there are about a half dozen people who are already being considered or thinking about the same lane. So I think it's going to be a really tough challenge for Nikki Haley or any Republicans traveling in that lane. And let me just say, Kamala Harris is going to be the vice presidential nominee, and we're only going to have one nominee for president, and that's going to be Joe Biden.
All right. From political to corporate inclusivity. Most women who are part of a racial or ethnic minority report they've experienced racism or discrimination, according to a new survey. These findings come as companies and organizations are pulling back on diversity and inclusion programs. Researchers found LGBT women were more likely to report they were discriminated against. In addition, women with darker skin tones were more likely to say they experienced racism in the workplace. Advocates charge companies that promise big changes after the 2020 George Floyd protests have not kept those promises. Hires for chief diversity officers had grown quickly 2 years ago, but have recently slowed to a crawl or even reversed course. Donna Edwards, is it time to end those diversity and inclusion programs that were so popular until recently at all the major corporations, all the, the Fortune 500s and such?
Look, I always worry that the whole term and phrase and ethos of diversity and inclusion would be a flavor of the month. And I think that that's exactly what has happened. And unfortunately, you can add a diversity and inclusion officer, you can make it a senior level officer of a corporation. But if you're not going to put in the work to change the culture from the bottom up in a corporation, I think what we've seen is many of those D&I officers are stepping back themselves because they realize there's not a real commitment beyond a title in inculcating diversity and inclusion in the entirety of the workforce. And so, if boards of directors and C-suites are not going to embed diversity and inclusion in their processes, I think it has little chance to succeed. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that these are fading by the wayside as the flavor of the month.
Let's get a little more specific because there's several phases of diversity and inclusion in corporations. One is in hiring and promotion. The other is in training. I get the feeling we've been talking a little more about the training, the sensitivity training programs. What about in hiring and promotion?
It does, but it requires a commitment, not just to hire the right people, but to have the right people doing the hiring. I think that is as important as well, because hiring officials always put their own biases in. And so the more diverse that pool can be in hiring, then the more likely it is that your workforce is going to display that in the people who are hired. And so it's a combination of those things. And frankly, I know that when I was coming up through corporate America, the one thing that I hated was being the only one. It is isolating and it's debilitating until there's a commitment so that you don't have somebody who's just hanging out there on their own. Then it's really difficult to make the kinds of changes throughout the workforce that are really important.
I appreciate very much what Donna has described. And it is crucially important to remove barriers. There's no question about it. And to create teams that have the kind of range of talent, and yes, diverse talent of all kinds and backgrounds of diverse sorts as well. And it's certainly been contended with persuasive quality that this makes a difference. I think some of the frustration, having witnessed peripherally, I'm not in corporate world currently, but I have friends who are. And I think some of the frustration is that a lot of these, and I've experienced it a little bit myself in other entities, the way in which DEI is carried out is with courses that the content of which tends to be perceived rightly, I think, as incredibly slanted in one direction, starts feeling like indoctrination and suppression. Diversity of viewpoints isn't really part of this, and it should be. Certainly, I think conservatives tend to feel that they have to mind very carefully what they say for fear of being singled out in other ways. So I think Donna's exactly right that we need to bear the importance of this in mind, but probably it's the execution of these concepts that needs examination, and that may be part of the retrenchment.
A lot of libertarians feel that, hiring by race or promoting by race is not the way to go. But again, that tends to keep things more the way they are, which is majority white, majority male.
So obviously, broadly hiring with realizing, at least in the back of your mind, that diversity is obviously a good thing, including people who have different backgrounds and understandings, is going to help almost every job market, right? I think the issue with this is that you're having these companies, let's say, Morgan Stanley, let's say Harvard University, companies that are responsible for doing more to entrench privilege, and if we want to call it white privilege, right, of the 0.001%, and they get to dress it up by giving, Robin DeAngelis or Corey or Ibram Kendi, $15,000, come give a talk. We can talk about how woke we are, and then we'll go back to our programs that make this country less of a meritocracy, that make it so that way where you're born is more of an indicator of where you're going to end up, right? They do everything. And so I think that's the issue. What is the actual goal of these programs? Is it just whitewashing? The way I think of it is like what Nike does with Colin Kaepernick, right? Uses Colin Kaepernick as their marquee man to show how woke they are. And then meanwhile, they're lobbying Congress to make sure that corporations like Nike can continue to use Uyghur slave labor sweatshops in China. Is that really woke, or is it just hijacking the vernacular of some left-wing activists to make it seem like what they're doing is inclusive, but it's actually the same old corporate BS they've been doing from the start?
What always goes through my mind when these stories come up and these issues is, how do we do incentives, to the corporate world or to Harvard? What's the incentives? Because I think, the tendency is to keep the way that it's always been done and throw in just a few little folks here and there and, have them be the figurehead of, look, we've, diversified.
Well, there's been a female president of Harvard University. Columbia just hired one. She's a woman of Islamic descent.
Yeah. And I think you'll probably see that more in universities, in academia than you are going to see in the corporate world. But, could there be tax incentives? Could there be things that we could do as a country and through our government to help incentivize, these businesses to do this? The public doesn't really pay attention. The public doesn't look at a company and say, do you have diversity? Do you have this? They're too busy. They don't care. So who's going to be the force to encourage this?
They do care in terms of buying products. I mean, it's been shown that look at all the money that companies are spending to go green, at least image-wise, if not in terms of the work that they're doing, like major oil and gas companies wanting to look green, even if they're not going green. So showing that you have people on your staff who think like the consumers who you want to buy your product it can be extremely effective.
I'd much rather not see government mandate these things, though.
Well, no, incentives, not mandate, incentives. You'll have a choice on what you want to do.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are values. I mean, those are values. And so the corporation has to demonstrate that it shares those values. And when they do, they actually open themselves up to new markets.
And let's remember, too, that this is not a new thing. I'm talking about diversity and inclusion in hiring, in promotion, in acceptance rate to big universities. There have been efforts to diversify for the last 50 years. And a lot of those efforts are probably responsible for the fact that, for example, you can complain about Harvard being racist in its or sexist in its hiring. The faculty is predominantly white male, but the student body is, and there's a lawsuit before the Supreme Court right now about this, the student body is something like 28% Asian American. So, and also a fairly generous, not as generous, but a great number of African Americans.
But where you see the most lopsided statistics about university faculties across the country is in terms of viewpoint. They are overwhelmingly of the left.
Bonnie, that lawsuit is happening because Harvard has been discriminating against Asian Americans so that way they can have more white legacy students and more of the minorities that they consider less privileged, right? Because Asians are too privileged, right?
I don't think that we should come to a conclusion yet, because that's the whole point of the lawsuit, is to determine whether there's been discrimination. Look, I think diversity and equity and inclusion have to be intentional.
Yes.
You have to want to do it and then figure out avenues that can happen so that you can diversify your workforce. And I think unless corporations, I don't think this is something that governments can impose on a corporation. It has to become part of the psychology of the corporation.
Nor, to my knowledge anyway, has it been imposed by government. This is all from pressure on corporations to sell products to people of color, which they, of course, want to do. And those kinds of societal pressures. But we're out of time. Thank you all. That's it for this edition. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.